So I'm going to go back to time real quick for a second. So we're almost wrapping up with the formal part of this. We talked a little bit about this already, but be realistic, all those things. So I'm going to share a couple of things with you about how to budget that time and how to best figure out what you can do with the time that you have. Right. So here's a production, actually wrong slide. Here's a production week schedule from last fall. Seems like a whole lot of time we have blocked off in the theater. It's pretty much all day, every day. But for those of you who work in the theater know that time gets eaten up really quickly, and it's not all necessarily usable time. You've got breaks to deal with. Other departments have to work on things. And so in this 12, 14-hour day, which is again a discussion for another time about why we're still doing that in 2020, we have that going on. We're not using all that time for work, and if we are, we're running ourselves ragged. So there's a couple of cool things that we can start doing outside of the theater that'll save us a lot of time when we're inside the theater. So for me, that's the question of what can we pre-program to make things faster once we're on site. So you don't have to have previs software to do this. You can use that Nomad software that we just looked at. You know, even without the dongle, you can use the Nomad software as an offline editor, essentially. And you can sit here, you can put all of your cues in. You can put your cue numbers in, you can put your labels in. They don't, you notice on this little screenshot here, there's no times, there's no actual value put into any of these cues yet, but they're all put in blind so that when I get to my theater, I can quickly start putting data in and I'm not spending that time typing a label in. It seems like a minuscule amount of time, but if you have 300 cues in your show and it takes you 5 or 6 seconds per cue to type in a label, maybe 10 seconds when you know that tiny little keyboard ETC gives you messes up and you have to backspace because your fingers don't all fit on it, that time adds up really quickly. And again, when every second is money, especially when you're actually in the theater, the more I can do to prevent wasting that time beforehand, the better. So the team and I, when we're doing shows, we do all of this in advance. We put all of our numbers in well in advance of even getting into the theater. We'll put times in, we'll put blocks in, we'll put asserts in, we'll do all of that kind of stuff as much as we can do, even if it has nothing to do with actual content of the cues before we get there. We can also pre-program groups. We can put in virtual magic sheets. We can create any kind of virtual magic sheets we need, anything like that. We can, of course, patch the show before we get there. And of course, you can also do some palettes. So even if you don't have hard data or perfect data in there, you can go through and put palette information. And I'm going to talk about palettes a little bit more in a second, though. And then, of course, you can also do pre-visualization. So if you're lucky enough or you're fortunate enough to actually have a pre-visualization software, you know, my team and I use Capture, there's Light Converse, there's MA3D, there's WYSIWYG, there's Vision, there's all kinds of big previs softwares out there. If you have the benefit of being able to use one of those things, you can actually start creating your cues beforehand. So I find that in a lot of my theater work, I don't do a whole lot of cue creation in previs because, you know, in a rock show, in a concert, it's a little bit easier because I'm not dealing with washes of 30 source 4 Lecos that are all cutting through the haze, right? And trying to get that level, that difference between 5 and 10% that has a big difference in the theater does not have a difference on my previs screen. If I was doing a lot of moving lights, I had music programming, stuff like that, then the previs makes a lot more sense. But even then, for those of you who work in that theater, in that concert world, you know that it's still not perfect and you still have to go back and touch things up when you get into the actual space. So instead, what I spend a lot of our previs time focusing on are focus palettes, color palettes, and beam palettes. So what I mean when I say a palette, hopefully most of you are familiar with these. If you're not familiar with a palette, it's a pretty universal concept amongst pretty much any lighting control software that you might use. So I encourage you to go to the websites of the consoles you're using, watch the training videos and stuff to learn more about this. But essentially what a palette allows me to do is have reference data in my show. So the concept here of absolute data versus reference data. So an absolute value would be something like channel 1 is going to be at red in Q1. Okay, I've typed it, I've put in hard values for that red, it's recorded into Q1. Versus a reference data where I say channel 1 is in my red palette or my red preset in Q1. So now as I start to go through my show, let's say that I have 50 cues in my show and 30 of those cues, that light needs to be red in them. But halfway through tech, I need to change what that red is. I've decided I want that red to be a little bit deeper, I want it to be a little less saturated. I don't want to have to go through and find every single cue that I have to update that in, right? Instead, if I update it just on the palette, it's now updated in every single one of those cues. So obviously really powerful for color, but also super powerful for focus positions. So this is especially true, like if you have a piece of scenery that the scene designer and the director can't quite figure out where they're going to place, if it doesn't matter if it changes every single day during tech, as long as all of my cues are referencing that piece of scenery focus palette, I update that once for wherever they've decided to put it that day, and boom, I've got everything. All my moving light presets are updated there. So absolute data versus reference data, super, super, super important. And the last thing we'll talk about when it comes to potential time savers is show control. So show control can either save you a whole lot of time, or it can cause you a whole lot more headaches and cost you a lot of time, right? So the advantages of show control, I'm able to do really complex queuing sequences. I can do sub bumps. I can do all kinds of things that a human might not be able to execute perfectly every single time, especially if it's not the same person operating the console every single time, or if it's, the stage manager's running the console and they've got other things they're dealing with as well. Saves time in that tech process because we don't necessarily have to run something multiple times over and over to get the timing right for the person pushing the buttons or the stage manager. Obviously, our stage managers have those cues in their books, but on some of the projects that I work on, we have a very limited tech time. And so if I can take a sequence away from that stage manager, that's going to help speed up that time, and it's going to help make the show run a little bit more smoothly. So a lot of times what the team and I will do as part of that pre-production process is we'll actually sit on a sits probe. And if you're not familiar with sits probe, basically what that is it's when the cast and the orchestra plays together for the first time. Usually it's not in the theater, it's still in the rehearsal room. But if they're playing with click tracks or they're playing with backing tracks or something like that, we'll actually go in and we'll set up a little Nomad station with a show control gateway, and we'll just go ahead and take our show control feed that night, and we'll sit there and we'll learn all of our timestamps well before we even get into the theater. So in theory, we could be doing, we could be the third day of tech seeing a song for the first time, and even if we've already got the cues programmed, and it's going to go ahead and run on its own because we've already got those timestamps put in. So it saves a whole lot of time over trying to learn all those things we get in the space. Of course, the disadvantage of that is it does take more programming time. If I didn't have that time to go to that sits probe, now I've got to do all of that work in the theater. So it's one more thing that I've got to keep in mind. I've got to budget for when I'm budgeting out my time. And then, of course, the big question is if something goes wrong, can the stage manager call this sequence? Sometimes they can, sometimes they can't. In 2020, I think it's a valid excuse. If time code drops away, so many things are running on that time code, it's a valid excuse to stop a show and fix it. I've seen a Broadway tour that happened to. I won't call it out by name, but it was like I was watching the sequence and I was like, something is wrong. Something is not firing properly here. And sure enough, they stopped the show, they reset, held for like 5 minutes, they rebooted all of the show control computers. I knew exactly what was happening back there, and then it ran and it was working perfectly. So, when I'm trying to talk to a company about doing this for the first time, which seems in the last couple of years, I've gotten more and more of my recurring clients to jump on the bandwagon with it. That's the big thing. It's like, well, what happens if it messes up? And I say, well, it messes up and we have to fix it. It's live theater. And, it's just another thing in 2020. That's another thing we have to deal with. So in addition to doing time code, you can also do other kind of show control stuff to make your life a little bit easier. OSC commands, MIDI show control commands, MIDI notes, MIDI time code, even doing remote physical triggers. So the picture you're seeing right now is a cool little analog patch-based system that I made a couple of years ago for an install that we did. So that, we had a Yamaha CL5, we had a Geo, we had a Clearcom box, we had a couple of other pieces of equipment like a Crestron processor and stuff like that. So I found these little DB25, DB15 breakout things that fit on this rack-mounted DIN rail, and then I could use little jumper wires to basically jump pin to pin and create my own like analog show control system. I actually wrote a blog about this as well. It's one of my first blog posts. You can go check that out, and you can see how I did that and get links to all these products and stuff. But it was a quick way. On my, I was the only one running events in this venue, so on my Yamaha console, I was able to I had user-defined keys that would open and close relays, and that relay open and close would then trigger a go or a back command back on my light board. So I wouldn't have to, I was the only one operating. I could do that from there. I could turn my Clearcom headset on and off with a user-defined key, all with these physical triggers. So all kinds of cool stuff. And ETC has a really cool video in their learning series about this kind of stuff as well.